This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so this is the final session of the Accelerated Greek class. And tonight we're going to talk about something that's just a little bit obscure to English speakers. Okay. I know I've talked to Chris before about the non-indicative system. Jennifer, do you know if there's anything equivalent to this in Hebrew? I honestly haven't studied it enough to know one way or the other.
Offhand, I don't know. Let me read more about what it is, and I'll look at it. I'll look and see if anything sounds familiar.
All right, so the non-indicative. So far we've been talking about the indicative system. So the non-indicative system is somewhat kind of almost philosophical in the way that it works. So he starts off here talking about how indicative verbs have a proper subject and they have the finite verbs are the main verb in the clause. Participles and infinitives are not true verbs, but verbules. In this particular thing, it talks about the non-indicative system, which is the idea of not something that necessarily is happening in reality. And I think I briefly touched on this last week. The thing about the non-indicative system is it's not things that are not true. A lie would be listed in the indicative system. A non-indicative is something that could happen but hasn't necessarily happened. Okay, so he's kind of broken it down here into different kind of ways to think about it. So he's got the indicative, which is going to be our basic. I'm going to have dinner for supper, or pizza for supper. That's something that's declaring a fact and the way things are in the world. You should have pizza for supper, or I may have pizza for supper. These are things that haven't necessarily happened, but they could potentially happen. Do not have pizza for supper. Mom, please make pizza for supper. So those are imperatives. If I just so happen to have pizza for supper, I'll let you know. That's the optative. Kind of, once again, something that could happen, and he's kind of put here, there's a little bit of doubt in it. Only the first sentence is actually declaring certainty of action. That's kind of a way to think about this, certainty of action. All the remaining sentences have varying degrees of probability. The first sentence would use the indicative mood because it's the only sentence that represents certainty. Okay. Does that make sense so far? Because if you don't understand the indicative, it's kind of hard to move on from there. Does everybody get that much of it?
I think we all get it, and it also has reference to so many different translations why some people say it the way they do. I agree.
Yeah, I'm going to point out kind of the classical, like when this happens in a second. Okay, so the non-indicative moods express probability, and that's the way I want you to think about it. So you've got some things that are really probable to happen, so probable that you speak of them almost like they already have happened or will happen. Okay, so the subjunctive mood expresses something that is probable. Okay, it probably will happen. And that's going to be the example we look at in a second. The imperative mood is used to express commands or requests. So it's something that we want to make happen, but it hasn't necessarily happened yet. The optative is something that is only remotely possible. I'll tell you, that's not very frequent in the Greek New Testament. We will see several subjunctives, but one of the nice things about the subjunctives is they're usually going to be linked with some of the particles we've already already learned. And whenever it's linked with one of these particles, it usually kind of leads you to what you imagine it would be, okay? So subjunctive expresses probability. Used to indicate an action that will probably happen, okay? Most often expressed with may, might, should, I would say was probably the most common. Could, when, whenever, or if. All right. I'll also point out that sometimes the word will may be just as good. Okay. Subjunctive is formed this way. You're going to notice that the thing that's going to stand out is this long vowel. Okay. Here's a paradigm. So, listen, okay. The things that we're going to see a lot is either an independent clause where it happens by itself. Most of the time you're going to be okay to stick with shall we or we shall, or sometimes should. Okay. These it doesn't have this. These are not as common up here. Most of the time what you're going to see is it used in conjunction with hina or hopos. So hina is our word that means in order to, and hopos means as a result. Whenever you see something that says so that we might, if you ever see that in one of your translations, so that we might, that is probably a translation of hina plus the subjunctive. Okay. And these have, similar to the participle things I told you about, there's also temporal and conditional. It's usually started off with hatan, eos, archi, mekri. So these all can in some way have the word when, first, those sort of things mixed in with it. Okay. Eon is if ever or if. Okay. So the particle will help you decide a lot of this sort of thing, because these first parts are always what the particle means, and then they've added the next part to it. The ones that are independent are the ones that generally are the most exegetically significant. And let's just look at the most famous. This. All right. All right. Who wants to play the translation game tonight? Then everybody jump on it at once. All right, Dad, why don't you do it? You ready?
Okay, where we at?
Right here. Okay. Hutos.
Because we're getting our Logos log set up. Just hang on just a second.
Can you see mine? It should be at the bottom of the page. Hey, can
Okay.
you see it?
Okay. Or thus in this way, or thus.
Okay. Gar.
That would be, you're saying for or therefore.
Yep. Agapesin.
To love.
So it's love, but it's aorist.
Yes, aorist, an active, indicative third person singular.
Okay. So it wouldn't be just love, it would be
To love. Or the giving of love.
what does aorist mean? It means it's the simple past. Okay.
Well, okay.
So it would be loved.
Oh, okay. Having been loved.
In this case, it would just be loved.
Okay.
So it's the simple past. Atheos.
That would be the love of God, or the God.
So God is in nominative, so that makes it our
That's our noun.
okay. So
Subject.
if this is a verb, what is our simple subject and simple predicate? What are we saying? So this is your noun, this is your verb.
Okay, it'd be God's love.
Love here is a verb. And it's past tense.
Loved God.
You can do it that way, but it's a lot easier to say what? If God is our subject.
That God loves.
That God had loved or loved.
God loved. Okay. So, thus, for. Most of the time, people want a word is at, or this is changed to kind of emphasize this. So, for, a good way to say it is in this manner, or in this way. For in this manner, God loved ton cosmon.
The world.
Aste?
So that or therefore.
We can do it this way. Edoken?
So that the Son.
Okay. Well, this is, I skipped to the end of the verb. Hoste, so that, edoken, so we have aorist of to give. So if you take to give and put it in the past, it becomes what?
Gave.
Given.
Hoste, so that he gave ton huion.
That would be thus his beloved Son. His one and only Son.
Well, yeah, we're going to get to that. Huion is son, ton monogene. So people have said that this is only begotten because it has two words in it, mono only, and then gene, which is begotten or to be begotten. The problem is that falls under our traditional, one of my favorite things I like to point out, the root fallacy, which is if you take two roots and put them together, the word that you get from it isn't the same. So butterflies and sawhorses have nothing to do with butter or a horse made out of saws. So
I've seen an elephant fly.
monogenes, one and only, or special, or something along those lines, is a better rendering of this. It's not so much that it's the fact that he's the only begotten. That's not what it's talking about. The main thing it's talking about is he's unique, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're all sons and daughters, but we're not all unique in the way that Jesus is unique. Okay. So that he gave his one and only, or his unique son, hina pos ha pistuon. Hina, we learned this word.
So that
Pos,
everyone,
yeah, we learned all, but in this particular case, everyone probably works a little better. Pos pistuon.
who believe.
So let's translate it as word for word as we can. So this is a participle. We learned how to do those last week. It's a present active participle. So everyone hopistuon. How would you translate that? I told you to start with just the simplest, adding the ing. So what would that be?
Believing.
Everyone believing.
Okay. Now, almost every single translation I've ever seen of this turns it into something that is a identifier. So it's almost always translated as who believes. But you can see here, if you want to be just word for word what it says, the who is kind of added. So pistuon is the believing. So in order that everyone believing or all believing, ace,
In
on,
here it's he, but would we say him?
now we'd say him. May,
Not.
apoleta.
Apometa would, okay, it would be perishing, not perishing.
Well, this is a subjunctive. You see that?
Oh, not to perish.
So if we wanted to convey the idea of something that could happen but probably won't happen, how would you say that?
Well, we would change, or I would, to may not perish or will not perish or should not perish.
We should not perish, or something like that, okay? So will not, shall not, may not. May, people, you get into this discussion of, okay, may to some degree suggest that it might not happen. So probably should is the safest way to do it.
Gotcha.
May that's possible. But what does, let's see, I think it's the NASB. Anybody have that in front of them?
I guess I'll have to look it up.
Let's see. Let's just bring up a few. But I'm kind of curious. All right, this is the NIV. NIV says shall not. Okay. This is the Net Bible. Net Bible came up really small, but this says will not perish.
Verse 16 in the NASB says, shall not perish.
Yeah. Here puts
Should not.
should not. So this is where the variation in this comes from, of why it's rendered different ways. The thing about it is, whenever you start talking about the subjunctive, as it's set up at the top, it does have the idea of somewhat being predictive. And as it's kind of talked about, the The thing about the subjunctive is it has this possibility of not happening, but more than likely it will. So I joke and tell people it's probably like somewhere between should and shall. People tend to say, you know, well, it should. That means that not everyone who believes will, and they kind of make that their hill to die on. What John is trying to convey here, I'm convinced, is, you know, under normal circumstances, if you are one of the believing ones, the thought is that you'll do what he says. So, yeah, more than likely you're not going to perish. But he understands that not everybody who believes is going to be willing to count the cost and actually do it. So he leaves this little bit of ambiguity for the possibility that someone might believe but not follow through with it. And that's most of the time how the subjunctive is used in the New Testament. And you can see here it is connected with a hina phrase, like I was talking about before, where you're going to have this signal word to set you off that, oh, I might be coming up to a subjunctive. Okay, does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
That's the subjunctive. It's probably the one that's the most complicated to wrap your mind around, but that's more or less what it conveys. Let's go ahead and finish this up. So,
Okay, yeah. But
okay,
to have
Zoane,
life, Zoane is life,
life, Ionion.
eternal,
All right.
eternal life. But have eternal life, I'm sure that's probably what we would say there.
Yep.
Let me ask you something. What
Yeah.
about what about those phrases that I may be even getting off a little bit, but what about phrases where, for example, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder? You were talking about the 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 case there, the word let,
So
the possibility, like the word may here.
we're going to get to that in a second, I think.
All right, I didn't want to run too far ahead. I just that popped in my mind when you used the word may a while ago.
So it showed there that you can translate a subjunctive as a hortatory, but most of the time the hortatory statements are going to be in the imperative mood. Okay, that's the next one we're going to talk about. So the imperative mood is something that is used to express a command. The kind of, and he puts here, the ball's in the court of the person receiving the command or request in order to actually go through with it. One of the things that is a little bit different and kind of makes this funky is that a second person statement can also come across as a command or an imperative. So if you have a second person statement where you say you go or something along those lines, that's actually slightly different than the imperative mood. But the one thing that's very different than English, in English we have the imperative mood, which is things like where you is the under such subject, go to the store, bring me that book, write me this paper, those sort of things. The odd thing, or at least odd to me, in the Greek language, the imperative can be in the third person and in the first person. This doesn't really talk about it much. And it usually only comes into effect in the first person plural. But you notice here, the second and third person can have commands in them. So here's my question. How do you express a command in the third person? What's the word you just used?
Let.
Let. So instead of saying go to this mountain, it becomes what we call a hortatory statement, which is let a man leave his wife or leave his parents and cling to his wife. Things like that become imperatives. Now, to us, let statements seem like they seem to me, at least, to some degree, kind of like suggestions. But there's some things to indicate that they might actually be stronger commands than those that are stated with you. Let a man take heed lest he fall. Things along those lines are in this particular mood, and they suggest things that are very important for you to do. Here's one. James 1:5. We'll go to this one. All right. A day, now if tis anyone, humon lepate, if anyone of you, lepate, lapetai, Sophia, if any one of you lacks wisdom, itato, and it's an imperative, let him ask, para tu didontas theou, let him ask from God, the granting one of all haplos sincerely. So the one who gives or grants to all sincerely. Kai me, and not ona de santes, and not having reproach or not being reproachable. Kai dosetatai auto, and he will be granted it. So there's this idea of let, okay? So in this sense in James says he gives this certain situation, and the command is, if you find yourself in this situation, if you lack wisdom, you ask God, okay? But instead of saying you, he's introduced this hypothetical anyone, and instead of saying you, he uses this hypothetical anyone as the subject of this imperative. Does that make sense?
It does the more we talk about it.
Quentin,
Yes.
I'm cutting in and out. Am I understanding that the let us phrases occur only in the third person?
No, but they can occur in the third person. They just don't in English. That's what I was pointing out.
Okay.
In English, we don't really have a third person imperative. But the let us statements that you find, those are generally, now as we saw, there are some subjunctives that can be translated that way, but generally, if you see a let us statement, it's usually in the imperative. I would say at least 4 out of 5 times whenever I've just been flipping through, because I was curious about this myself. At least it seemed 4 out of 5 times whenever I saw something that was a let us statement, it was actually in the imperative. And as I mentioned before, I don't know if you were here for this part of it, Victoria, a lot of times those are actually stronger commands than you commands. All right. And these, like anything else, you can add the may to make it negated. I didn't mention this before, but I think I've said this at least a couple times. You use the word oo for not whenever you're in the indicative system. You use the word may for not when you're in the non-indicative system. All right. The optative is odd. And you can see there's only 68 in the entire New Testament, less than 1% of the verbs in the New Testament. So the nice thing about this one is you're probably not going to see it that often. So only occurs in the present and aorist, so that narrows it down even more. And we didn't learn this, but the me, they're like the endings of the me verbs. They kind of in this, me-ish endings. They have sort of a weird pattern to them compared to the other ones that we're going to learn later. Okay, and you can see here the markers, the iota. Did he even use an example for this one? Doesn't look like it. Oh, here you go. This is what he says to do. Since it is so infrequent, the best is to simply consult Wallace's Greek grammar beyond the basics. For those of you who own that, I believe every one of them are listed in there. But it is, you could do something like, let's go back up to his example here. With the pizza, he said something along the lines of, if it just so happened, okay? This would actually be a very good way to introduce an optative because the chances of it happening are very low. I know this occurs in Hebrews at least once, and he uses it for an argument that he says this thing was so infinitely unlikely to happen that even if it were, and the point of his rhetoric is that even if it were true, it still would mean Jesus was greater. That was the basis of his argument was, yes, this is very unlikely to be true, but even if it were true, it doesn't change the way things are. And if I remember right, most of these, I haven't studied all 69 or whatever he said of them. I haven't studied them all, but the ones that I have come across are kind of in that vein of things where they're almost used for rhetoric's sake to make a point that this is very unlikely to happen. Okay. All right. So I would say understand the subjunctive, understand the imperative, look up the optative. Okay. So the last one is an infinitive. Does anybody know what an infinitive is? I mean, this is true in English too.
It says right down here, part noun and part verb.
Okay, what does that mean? How can something be part noun and part verb? So the infinitive is usually the to statements, okay? So running or runs would be a verb, okay? To run would be a noun. The idea of to run, to think, to eat, to sleep. All of those are infinitives, okay? In a lot of languages, not Greek, but in a lot of languages, you learn the infinitive form whenever you're learning the word, and then you conjugate it afterward. In Greek, the lexical form is the infinitive. In Greek, the lexical form is determined by the first person singular, singular masculine nominative. But like Spanish, when you learn verbs, usually you learn the infinitive first, and then you learn how to conjugate the infinitive. Okay. So a lot of times these will be connected with another word. And in that handout I gave the people at Woodbury, they're all on there to all the different ways to connect it with other words. So this is a possibility. The infinitive can be a subject, so emoi gar tozoain Christos, for me to live, and because there isn't any type of other word here, it's an understood amy. So for me to live is Christ, and to apothanein, to die, and to die, kedros, is beneficial or to gain. Okay. It can also be the accusative. Now, last year revived concern for me. In these cases, it usually doesn't have the two. The most common one that we're probably going to run across is going to be linked with that's not what I'm looking for. You're going to run across a few of these. So this is the, let's do this one first. So you can, I did that one. There we go. So this is an appositional infinitive. So you can also have an infinitive or infinitive phrase with an accusative or neuter article. Here you have, for this is the will of God that your holiness, apekesethai, so that your holiness will abstain you or keep you away from, abstain you from sexual immorality, porneus. Okay. This is an apposition. It's related to this whole thing, but it's this idea of this introduces it. This phrase is all considered as one. You could put two here if you wanted to. So to abstain from fornication, but they bring this word here, the apa. I guess they actually use apa with that. Yeah, I guess they add the word that in his translation. I would say to abstain. That's probably more word for word. So to abstain from sexual immorality. Yeah, you're going to see, especially this one, anai, it's often used, and it'll often follow this word legeta. So legeta is you say. Who do you say that I am? Okay. The one that I was looking at, that I was looking for, oh, here we go. A lot of times the word ace will be paired with infinitives, and ace means either into, sometimes it can be in. Whenever it's paired with an infinitive, a lot of times you just put to, and you can see them doing that here. And they led him away to crucify him. So many of the times the ace will drop off as far as meaning goes, but it sets off that this is going to be a infinitive phrase that sort of stands alone. Most of the time, infinitives won't be found by themselves. They'll be linked to a preposition like this. Yeah, Preposition plus article infinitive is the most common construction. That's the main thing. This will take care of most of your translation. So preposition, article, infinitive, you're going to have something like what we see right here that I was showing you a second ago. Where'd he go? Yeah, this one. This last thing that's under bullet number 11.36, this is going to be what most of the ones you're going to see. Okay. If you see something that is labeled as an infinitive, start off by trying to use the word to and go from there. If you want to consult this, this can be helpful, but many times you're going to be just fine by looking at the context and saying it the way that you would. So, and into sperain, and in he sowed, that doesn't make sense. With he sowed doesn't make sense. Into he sowed doesn't make sense. While he sowed, okay, that one makes sense. So most of the time you're going to be figure out what it is based on just looking at it and figuring out what makes sense in the context. These are fairly fluid with what they mean, and you're going to be able to look at your context and, like I said, figure out what it means. Now, you see here, you do not need to determine the infinitive function translation on your own. So he's kind of pointing out here that they're not necessarily consistent with how they can be used. The same as we saw with participles last week. So his flow chart is very similar to the other one. I will tell you that you see here it says the tense of an infinitive is hard to translate. Almost every person I have talked to have said you really almost should not try to give any form of tense to an infinitive. That if you try to start talking about aspect even with an infinitive, that you're missing the point, because the point is it's functioning as a noun. That's what you're supposed to be trying to convey, and you should be working more on conveying the idea of the noun part of it rather than the aspect part of it. Many times you'll, like I said, just translate it as to, or you can just use the word itself. I really think he kind of overcomplicated this section, to be honest. Infinitives are not as difficult as this wall of text would make you believe. It's a verb that's functioning like a noun. You added a word to make it function like a noun. Okay? Does anyone have any questions on that? I know I kind of I don't want to say that I glossed over it, because I think I did do it justice, but I think he spent more time on this section than what's reasonable. What other questions do you guys have? About anything that we've covered? Okay, so here's my suggestion, and I pulled this up here for this reason. I'm guessing that everybody who is in this class is planning on taking the class in the fall. Yes?
We'll be
Yeah, I
right
think
here.
so, yep.
Hopefully we can recruit Janet and Tony back. We'll check on them.
Okay, so the plan is to go through basically all the material that we've covered this summer over the next year and a half. Okay, we're more or less going to go over the same material again with a different book, but you can see here each of them has a second time around section. I will tell you, I've looked at those, and if you use those to review the chapters that we're doing for Basics of Biblical Greek whenever we start in a couple weeks, if you use that, you probably are going to do just fine as far as a review. See if there's anything else on here that I found useful. That's the main thing. So now you have the ability to do a little bit of translating. So we've done the practical aspect of it. Whenever we start in the fall, we're going to be doing more of the technical memorization side of it. Okay? Best of luck.